Imagine living in a time when wearing pants or even smoking in public was considered scandalous for women. A time when you couldn't vote, couldn't have a say in the country's laws and policies, and were limited to mundane tasks like cooking and cleaning. It's hard to believe that this was the reality for women in the United States just over 100 years ago. In this video, we're going to explore the shocking and unjust restrictions placed on women in the past. Get ready to be amazed and outraged as we reveal 13 things that women weren't allowed to do 100+ years ago. Vote. Did you know that women in the United States were once denied the right to vote? Right. It wasn't until 1920 that women could finally mark their X on a ballot. And you know what that means? For a while, women had to stand idly by and watch men make all the decisions. It's hard to imagine, but thanks to the tireless efforts of amazing women like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the 19th Amendment was finally ratified, granting women the right to vote. These suffragists fought hard for what they believed in, and their tenacity and determination paved the way for the rights and freedoms we enjoy today. Easily obtain birth control. You may take birth control for granted now, but did you know that just over 60 years ago, it wasn't even legal? That's right, they didn't even have the right to decide what happens to their own bodies. Women had limited options and were left at the mercy of the patriarchal powers that be. But thanks to the bold and brave activism of Margaret Sanger, women's reproductive rights were given a fighting chance. Despite being arrested just days after opening the first birth control facility in the US, Sanger never wavered in her fight for women's freedom in childbearing matters. Today, women have a range of contraceptive options available to them, and it's all thanks to trailblazers like Sanger, who refuse to let outdated laws and societal norms hold them back. Divorce. Thank your lucky stars that you weren't living in the early days of America when it came to divorce. It was a legal labyrinth that women especially found themselves trapped in. Different laws applied depending on where you lived, and judges had wide discretion in granting or denying a divorce. Imagine having to wait for your husband to beat you a certain number of times before you could even consider filing. And even then, some states still made divorce illegal. It wasn't until 1949 that South Carolina finally joined the rest of the country in recognizing it. So, if you're ready to cut ties with your spouse, just remember how far we've come. Wear pants. Step into the time machine with me, and let's travel back to the era when women weren't allowed to wear pants. Yes, you heard that right. It sounds crazy now, but it wasn't too long ago when it was against the law for women to don anything that remotely resembled men's clothing. Imagine going about your day-to-day life and suddenly you're stopped by a law enforcement officer for wearing pants. That's precisely what women had to go through in the 19th and 20th centuries. They were prohibited from wearing trousers because it was considered dressing like men. Sounds ridiculous, right? But that's not all. Even if women defy these laws, they were still frowned upon by society. It's hard to believe that something as mundane as pants could cause such a stir, but it did. That's why we need to thank the fashion world for breaking down these antiquated ideas and pushing boundaries. Thanks to trailblazing designers like Coco Chanel and daring Hollywood actors like Marlene Dietrich, pants slowly began to gain acceptance in the fashion world from the 1910s to the late 1920s. Today, we have a plethora of options to choose from: jumpsuits, denim jeans, yoga pants, you name it. But it's essential to remember that these options were not always available to women. Keep their maiden name. Many modern women prefer to continue using their birth name even after marriage. However, there was once a time when it was once considered taboo for a woman to keep her birth name after tying the knot, and the consequences were severe. Not only was it socially frowned upon, but some businesses would even refuse to pay a woman who continued using her maiden name. Women who dared to keep their birth name after marriage were also denied the right to vote in some cases. That's right. Their decision to hold onto their identity could cost them their basic right to participate in the democratic process. Thankfully, times have changed, and women now have the freedom to choose whether or not they want to take their husband's last name. It wasn't until 1976 that the requirement for a woman to adopt her husband's surname was abolished in all states except Hawaii. Smoke in public. These days, numerous places are off limits to smokers, But in the past, many people could light up wherever. Those people were all males. Women smokers faced a social stigma if they were seen puffing away in bars and restaurants alongside their male counterparts. Things took a turn for the worse in 1908 when New York City passed a law outlawing female smokers in public places. However, the controversial law was short-lived, and it was voted down by the mayor after only 2 weeks. This opened the door for establishments and the general population to embrace the idea that women smoking in public is just as acceptable as men doing the same. The 1920s saw cigarette companies jump on the bandwagon and start advertising their products to women. They positioned cigarettes as torches of liberty and made them a symbol of women's empowerment. Owned property if they were married. It wasn't legal for a married woman to own real estate in the United States until 1848. The law states that your partner owns everything you own, regardless of how you acquired it. The Married Women's Property Act, established in 1848, promoted the equal ownership and administration of assets between a married woman and a single man. Since then, other jurisdictions have adopted legislation that is strikingly similar to this one. However, progression was plodding. Although all jurisdictions had signed Married Women's Property Acts by 1900, widespread acceptance of these laws did not occur until much later. Remember, this was before women could vote and when they generally followed their husband's lead. Women of all economic classes didn't start exercising their privileges and making more choices until the 1920s, during Prohibition. Eventually, a married woman has the legal right to decide about her assets during her lifetime and at her passing. Join the military. Thank you for serving the nation if you are a woman who has been a soldier. There was a time when that wasn't doable, but now it is. Even though women have a long history of service in the military in fields such as healthcare, they were not eligible for service as registered soldiers, and most of the positions they did hold were non-payment. Because of the severe shortage of male personnel throughout World War II, the Army began accepting female auxiliary members in 1942. In 1948, the Army established the Women's Army Corps, WAC, to officially enable women to join the Army in the deposits. At long last, women had the opportunity to advance professionally, receive pay and perks, and serve their country abroad. Shop without an escort. Imagine being an adult woman, still required to have a babysitter when she goes out in public. In the 19th century, this was the norm. Women were required to have a male companion if they ventured out of the house. In the last years of the 19th century, however, the introduction of department stores started changing this. The earliest shops started catering to women by providing a neutral space to shop, chat, and feel secure. The success of these establishments inspired others, and soon women could enter many eateries and cinemas without a male chaperone for the first time. However, women from affluent backgrounds enjoyed most of these new liberties. It wasn't until the 1920s that large-scale retail chains started advertising to and serving customers from various socioeconomic backgrounds. Work-fair hours. Women have historically faced discriminatory practices and numerous forms of harassment, including sexual assault at work. However, they had few constitutional protections on the worksite, and no hours were governed until over 100 years ago. Yet, women in Oregon were not allowed to work over 10 hours per day due to state legislation. In 1908, the Supreme Court heard arguments on a case to overturn this. The highest court concurred with the lower court's decision that laundry company owner Mueller couldn't force his female employees to work longer than the legally allowed 10-hour shifts. Unfortunately, the court's decision wasn't based on fairness, but the fact that working such long shifts disrupted a mother's ability to care for her children. Nonetheless, the trial had far-reaching consequences for labor laws in the United States, with many states eventually adopting similar policies in the following decades. Serve on a jury. While it is customary to have a jury of one's equals, the Supreme Court ruled in 1879 that governments may legally exclude women from jury duty. Utah was the first jurisdiction to rule in 1898 that women could also be on juries. After that, some other regions complied, albeit gradually. In 1927, only 19 states did not prohibit female citizens from sitting on juries. In 1961, the Supreme Court overturned a Florida legislation that had exempted women from being jurors. Compete in a wide variety of Olympic sports. It's hard to imagine a time when women weren't allowed to participate in the Olympics if you're a big admirer of Olympians like Simone Biles. Not until the 1900 Games in Paris, and even then, they made up below 3% of the total athlete roster. For the most part, this was because they could participate in only 5 different kinds of sports. Slowly but surely, a growing number of Olympic sports began welcoming women. Nowadays, the Olympic Board strives to ensure that more women are granted leadership positions within the Olympic movement. Have their own passport if they were married. Before the 1920s, only unmarried women could apply for and receive their respective passports, while married women had to apply for and receive passports under their spouses' names. This reflected the societal stigma attached to women embarking on a trip without her husband. Even more significantly, it reflected widespread cultural beliefs that a woman's sense of self was intertwined with her partner's. More and more empowered women started fighting against this, mainly if it meant giving up their mother's surname. In 1917, a young woman named Ruth Hale argued in court for the right to use her mother's surname on her passport. This turning point encouraged many women to advocate for equal rights in the following years. The regulations were modified formally in 1937. Just a few decades ago, women's lives in the United States of America were considerably different, weren't they? Thankfully, with long-lasting advocacy for women's rights, society is much more open and equal to females. What do you think? Tell us in the comment section below. If you think this video is helpful, like and subscribe for the latest notifications.